BMW just cut its own profit forecast for 2026, twice. The automotive division's margin, once guided between 4 and 6%, is now expected to land somewhere between 1 and 3%. Group profit before tax is heading for what the company itself calls a significant decline. China, BMW's largest single market for over a decade, shrank by double digits in the first quarter, and somewhere in a Munich design studio sits the current M5. It weighs 5,390 pounds. The very first M5, built in 1985, weighed 3,153 pounds. That is not a rounding error. That is a car that gained the weight of a small motorcycle, an extra passenger, and a full tank of gas, generation after generation, while the company kept telling everyone it still built the ultimate driving machine. Here is the question. Nobody at BMW headquarters seems willing to answer directly. How does a company that built its entire identity, its entire advertising history, its entire reason for existing around the feeling of driving, end up here? Losing money in its biggest market, backpedaling on a subscription plan for heated seats, cutting guidance twice in 1 year, while its most important new product line still hasn't proven itself in the one country that matters most. This is not a story about tariffs. Tariffs are real, but they are not the disease. This is not really a story about China either, although China is where the symptoms are showing up first and loudest. BMW is still enormous. The company sold 2.46 million vehicles worldwide last year, across BMW, Mini and Rolls-Royce, and it remains one of the world's leading premium car manufacturers by almost any measure. That scale is exactly what makes this story worth telling. A company this large does not collapse because of one bad quarter. It gets here through a long chain of small, individually defensible decisions that each looked perfectly fine in isolation. This is a story about a company that spent 40 years perfecting a formula for what a great car actually is, and then spent the next 30 years quietly, reasonably, defensively, taking that formula apart piece by piece, decision by decision, until almost none of the original recipe was left. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how BMW got from there to here, and you will understand why the billions it's betting on its next generation of cars might not fix what's actually broken. To understand what BMW broke, you have to understand what it built. In 1959, BMW was days away from being absorbed by Mercedes-Benz. The company was nearly bankrupt. Its lineup was a confused mess of tiny bubble cars and oversized luxury sedans, and shareholders were seriously debating whether BMW should even continue to exist as an independent brand. It was the Quandt family, stepping in with fresh capital at the last possible moment, that kept BMW alive, betting everything on a new line of mid-size sedans called the Neue Klasse. Those cars introduced the formula that would define BMW for the next 4 decades. A light body, a smooth, high-revving inline-six engine, near-perfect weight balance between the front and rear axles. Steering that told the driver exactly what the front tyres were doing at every single moment, without a computer translating that feeling into something vaguer. In 1975, an American ad agency called Amorati & Puris took that formula and gave it a name: the ultimate driving machine. It debuted right after a BMW race car won at Sebring, and it worked immediately. BMW's American sales jumped from 15,000 cars in 1974 to over 100,000 within a decade. The tagline's creator, Martin Puris, said the phrase would last forever, as long as BMW kept building cars true to that formula. For a long stretch it did. The E33 series in the 1980s, later immortalized by the E30 M3, one of the most beloved sports sedans ever built. The E39 5 Series in the late 1990s, still cited by engineers and journalists today as one of the best handling sedans ever put into production. The M division itself grew out of this same obsession, founded to build cars stripped of anything that didn't serve the driver, then sold in small numbers to people who understood exactly what they were buying. These were not luxury barges stuffed with gadgets. They were light, mechanically honest, and built around one single idea. The person behind the wheel matters more than anything else in the car. If you're finding this series useful, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because we're about to walk through exactly how that idea started to erode, one small decision at a time. The clearest way to see what BMW built and later lost is to look at weight. The original 1985 M5 weighed 3,153 pounds. The E34 M5 that followed it in the early 1990s came in at £3,638. The E39 M5, widely considered the high point of the entire model line, weighed £3,737. Each generation added weight, but slowly, and each one still felt like a driver's car first and a luxury product second. That was the era BMW built its reputation on. Naturally aspirated engines that revved cleanly to redline with no turbo lag to dull the response. Steering with almost no filter between the driver's hands and the road surface underneath them. A sedan that could carry a family to school during the week, and embarrass dedicated sports cars on a back road on the weekend. Car magazines ran out of superlatives. Owners became evangelists who never wanted to drive anything else. An entire generation of engineers grew up wanting to work for this specific company because of what these cars represented to them personally. And then, in 2001, BMW launched a new 7 Series that would quietly start unwinding all of it. Not because the engine was worse, the engine was fine. It was everything else about that car that marked the beginning of a very different chapter, one that had almost nothing to do with how a BMW drove, and everything to do with how it looked and how it made you interact with it every single day. The 2001 E65 7 Series was designed under Chris Bangle, and its styling, especially the rear end, was so divisive that owners and critics gave it a nickname that stuck for years: Bangle Butt. Some of that design was genuinely driven by engineering needs, crosswind stability and aerodynamics chief among them. But the styling wasn't actually the biggest change hiding inside that car. The bigger change sat on the centre console. The E65 introduced iDrive, BMW's first attempt at controlling most of a car's functions through a single rotary knob connected to one central screen. The idea made sense on paper. Fewer buttons, less visual clutter, one unified system instead of 20 separate switches scattered across the dashboard. The problem showed up almost immediately. Engineers kept adding functions to the same system year after year. Simple tasks, adjusting the temperature, changing a radio station, got buried 3 or 4 menus deep. Reviewers at the time described the learning curve as steep and the menu structure as genuinely confusing for new owners. BMW spent the better part of 2 decades quietly fixing iDrive. A menu button arrived in 2003, so drivers could escape back to the home screen. The interface got meaningfully cleaner in 2016. The system kept absorbing more and more of the car's physical controls with every redesign, right up through the curved display era that debuted in 2021, merging the instrument cluster and the touchscreen into one continuous piece of glass. But the underlying habit that iDrive first revealed never actually went away. Every few years, BMW would look at a car that already worked perfectly well and ask what more could be added to it instead of asking what could be safely removed. Keep that in mind because it comes back later in a much more expensive form. Complexity has a cost, and by the mid-2000s, BMW's own reliability numbers were starting to show it. Consumer Reports flagged several mid-2000s models as below average for the segment. Owners who had been loyal to the brand for decades started reporting expensive repairs on cars barely out of their factory warranty. Turbocharged engines like the N54 and the N63 developed reputations for costly, recurring problems, particularly around fuel systems and oil consumption. Forums filled up with longtime BMW drivers admitting the brand they loved didn't feel nearly as dependable as it used to feel a decade earlier. Meanwhile, the weight kept climbing, and now it was climbing fast. The E60 M5, launched in 2005 with a screaming high-revving 10-cylinder engine, weighed 3,869 pounds. The next generation, the F10, jumped all the way to 4,123 pounds once BMW added a turbocharger, all-wheel drive, and a lot more standard equipment. The F90 that followed weighed roughly the same. Then came the car sitting in showrooms right now. The G90 M5, BMW's first ever plug-in hybrid M5, weighs 5,390 pounds. That's 2,237 pounds heavier than the car that started the whole lineage back in 1985, an increase of more than 70%. It is, by a wide margin, the heaviest M5 BMW has ever built, and reviewers now spend as much time discussing its curb weight as they do its lap times. Every single one of these decisions had a defensible reason sitting behind it. Safety regulations, genuine customer demand for more equipment, heavy hybrid batteries, Taken individually, none of them looks reckless at all. Taken together, over 30 years, they describe a company slowly replacing the one thing that made its cars special with more of almost everything else instead. But BMW wasn't finished adding cost to its cars. It was about to start charging customers a monthly fee for features that were already sitting inside them. In 2020, BMW rolled out something called Functions on Demand, a system that let owners activate certain features after buying the car for a recurring fee rather than a one-time purchase. On paper, it sounded like flexibility. A customer could try adaptive cruise control for a month before committing to it permanently, or add high beam assist later without ever visiting a dealer. In practice, it meant BMW had started selling cars with hardware already physically installed at the factory, then asking owners to pay again every single month just to switch that hardware on. The first real flashpoint came in 2022, when BMW began charging around $18 a month for heated seats in markets, including the UK, Germany and South Korea. The seats themselves were already built into the car. Customers weren't paying for new hardware at all. They were paying rent on a switch they had technically already bought. The backlash was immediate and loud. A Cox Automotive survey that year found that the large majority of car buyers agreed that features on demand would simply let automakers extract more money from them, and most said they would seriously consider shopping a different brand entirely if a manufacturer locked existing features behind a subscription like this. For a company that had spent 50 years selling the idea that its cars belonged completely to the person driving them, this looked like the exact opposite message. BMW had just spent 2 decades adding features nobody asked for through iDrive. Now it was charging a monthly subscription for features that had always been standard equipment. Even after backing away from the heated seats specifically, BMW kept the broader subscription structure in place. Adaptive suspension, high beam assist, safety camera information, adaptive cruise control, even a welcome light animation projected onto the ground beside the driver's door. All of it still sits behind the same Functions on Demand storefront today, either as a one-time purchase or a recurring fee depending on the feature. Both decisions, the buried menus and the monthly subscriptions, came from the same instinct, treating the car less like a finished product you own outright and more like a platform to keep extracting value from long after the sale is done. The next mistake would prove that instinct hadn't gone away at all. By September 2023, the backlash had gotten expensive enough that BMW reversed course. Board member Peter Noter told the trade press, "What we won't do anymore is offer seat heating by subscription." Heated seats went back to being a simple factory option, in or out, with no monthly fee attached ever again. It was the right call. It also came only after real damage to BMW's reputation had already been done, and after competitors had spent a full year publicly pointing at BMW as the example of exactly what not to do to your own customers. Around the same time, BMW's design language was drawing its own separate wave of criticism. The XM, a large hybrid SUV launched in 2022, was singled out by design critics for busy, cluttered styling that seemed to pile on visual features rather than commit to one clear identity. One industry commentator argued that BMW's newer interiors felt luxurious in isolation, but no longer felt distinctly like a BMW specifically, a brand that had once been instantly recognizable partly because it avoided exactly that kind of clutter. None of these individual choices, the buried menus, the monthly subscriptions, the added weight, the busier styling, would have mattered much if the cars underneath them were still winning in the market the way they used to. For a long while, BMW's sales numbers made it easy to ignore every warning sign. That stopped being true in 2025. In 2025, BMW's operating profit fell 11.5%, down to €10.2 billion. That's the company's lowest profit since the pandemic. The automotive division's profit margin slipped to 5.3%, well below the 8 to 10% range BMW had set as its own internal target. Combined BMW and Mini sales in China fell over 13% that year, even as the overall Chinese car market actually grew by more than 20% around them. 2026 got worse. First quarter revenue dropped 8.1% to €31 billion. BEV deliveries fell 20% as subsidies dried up in both the US and China at the same time. China sales fell another 10%. BMW cut its full-year profit guidance once in the spring. Then, Just weeks ago, it cut that same guidance again. The automotive margin target, once 4 to 6%, is now guided at just 1 to 3%. Group profit before tax is expected to fall significantly for the year. BMW is now accelerating cost cuts across the entire company, and the financial pain from those cuts will land squarely in the second half of this year. BMW's own leadership insists the strategy itself doesn't need to change, only the speed of execution. That's a striking thing to say out loud after cutting guidance twice in 6 months. It's also, in a strange way, consistent with everything else in this story. BMW has rarely announced a crisis of direction. It just keeps insisting each number is explainable, right up until enough of those numbers pile up at the same time. The company is pinning almost all of its hopes for a turnaround on Neue Klasse, an entirely new platform of electric vehicles named directly after the cars that saved BMW from bankruptcy back in 1959. The first model, the iX3, just started reaching customers in Europe this spring, with a sedan built in Munich and a US launch expected by September. Whether it can win over Chinese buyers who now have dozens of cheaper domestic electric options sitting right next to it on the showroom floor is still a completely open question. So what actually went wrong here? It came down to 3 mistakes, made across 3 decades, each one perfectly reasonable on its own. First, BMW mistook adding for improving. iDrive was supposed to simplify the car. Instead, every redesign buried more functions inside more menus, and that same instinct, to add rather than remove, quietly spread into torque, into weight, and eventually into styling nobody had actually asked for. Second, BMW mistook monetization for innovation. Functions on demand turned a car customers already owned outright into a platform for recurring fees, and the heated seat backlash proved something important. Customers can absolutely tell the difference between a genuinely new feature and an old one with a paywall bolted on top of it. Third, BMW mistook mass for progress. A 1985 M5 weighed 3,153 pounds and became an all-time legend. Today's M5 weighs 5,390 pounds, and reviewers now spend as much time discussing its curb weight as they do its actual performance on track. None of these mistakes alone would have sunk the company. Together, spread across 30 years, they slowly eroded the one thing BMW's entire business was originally built on: the belief that nobody else on Earth made the driver feel quite like this. An electric motor doesn't care about any of that history. It can't rev, it can't reward a driver for using a manual gearbox well, and every other automaker on the planet is chasing the same instant torque figures BMW is chasing. Whether Neue Klasse can genuinely rebuild that belief through software and design instead of an engine note, or whether it just repeats the same instinct inside an electric shell, is the question that will decide BMW's next decade. If you want to see this same pattern playing out at another German icon right now, the next video in this series covers how Mercedes-Benz is making almost the same mistakes, just a few years behind BMW on the timeline. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you in the next one.